How did a single sergeant with a welding torch defeat one of history's greatest military minds, using the enemy's own weapons against them? July 1944, the Hedgerows of Normandy. 6 weeks after the largest amphibious invasion in history, the most powerful army ever assembled stood paralyzed. Over 1 million Allied troops, thousands of tanks, and unlimited air superiority, all grinding to a bloody halt against an obstacle as ancient as medieval France itself. But Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had transformed these pastoral walls of earth and vegetation into a killing ground more effective than any fortress. Every field became a death trap, every lane a carefully prepared ambush. And at the heart of Rommel's defense lay the very steel beach obstacles he had ordered and placed along the Atlantic wall, massive metal hedgehogs designed to rip apart landing craft. Those same obstacles would soon be turned against him in the most ironic twist of the entire Normandy campaign, thanks to a 29-year-old tank sergeant from New Jersey who refused to accept the impossible. Sergeant Curtis Grub Culin III wasn't supposed to be a hero. Born February 10, 1915, in Cranford, New Jersey, he lived an ordinary life at 215 Holly Street before the national emergency called him to service after Pearl Harbor. By June 1944, Culin served as a tank commander in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the New Jersey National Guard, the storied Essex Troop, attached to the 2nd Armored Division. He had landed in France shortly after D-Day, expecting to lead the charge across Europe. Instead, he found himself trapped in a nightmare landscape that defied every principle of armored warfare. The Bocage country of Normandy presented a problem that threatened to derail the entire Allied strategy. These weren't ordinary hedgerows. Rising 10 to 12 feet high, some hedges towered like ancient walls, their roots entangled for centuries into earthen banks so dense they could stop artillery shells. Towering vegetation crowned each barrier, creating corridors of death where German defenders could hide entire regiments. Every field, and there were tens of thousands of them, was surrounded by these natural fortifications, creating a patchwork maze that reduced visibility to mere yards. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, had recognized the tactical goldmine these hedgerows represented. When he arrived in Normandy to oversee the Atlantic Wall's construction in late 1943, he immediately understood that if the Allies broke through the beaches, the Bocage would become Germany's next line of defense. He ordered his forces to turn every crossroads into a strongpoint, every gap in the hedgerows into a kill zone covered by anti-tank weapons and machine guns. His defensive doctrine was brutally simple: let the hedgerows do the killing. The same brilliant mind that had orchestrated desert warfare now weaponized the landscape itself. Rommel stationed Panther and Tiger tanks in concealed positions where their superior guns could dominate the few openings between hedgerows. He placed anti-tank guns to cover every lane and track. German infantry, armed with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks, could approach within meters of Allied armor unseen, exploiting the dense vegetation. And unlike the open desert where Rommel had made his name, here every advantage belonged to the defender. By early July 1944, the situation had become critical. 7 weeks after D-Day, American forces remained bottled up in the Normandy lodgment, measuring their advances in hundreds of yards rather than miles. The hedgerows were bleeding the U.S. First Army white. Every attack followed the same horrifying pattern. When American tanks attempted to crash through a hedgerow by ramming it repeatedly, they exposed their thinnest armor, the vulnerable belly plates, to German anti-tank guns positioned in the next field. The angle required to climb over the earthen embankment tilted the Sherman's hull skyward, presenting a perfect target for Panzerfaust teams hiding just beyond the hedge. Dozens of American tanks burned in front of hedgerows they could see but couldn't penetrate. The deafening crack of German 75 men 88 guns became the soundtrack of daily terror for U.S. tankers. Combat engineers tried blowing gaps through the hedgerows with satchel charges and demolitions. For 3 brutal hours, Engineer teams would work under fire to place explosives, risking their lives for every yard gained. The explosions did create breaches, but the noise immediately alerted every German position within a mile. Enemy mortar and artillery fire would rain down on the gap before American armor could exploit it. Casualties among the engineers reached catastrophic levels. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, watched his timetable disintegrate. The British and Canadian forces attacking Caen to the east faced their own team of German panzer divisions, but at least they were holding the bulk of German armor. Bradley's mission was to break out to the west and south, to unhinge the entire German defensive line. But how could he break out when every hedgerow enclosed field became a miniature battle? By mid-July, the pressure on Bradley reached the breaking point. The Americans had suffered thousands of casualties for gains measured in single digits of miles. The massive logistical buildup pouring through the Normandy beaches was creating a dangerous concentration of men and materiel in too small a space. If the Germans counterattacked with sufficient force, they might drive the Allies back into the sea. Churchill and Eisenhower demanded results. The newspapers back home questioned why the world's most powerful military couldn't defeat farmers' hedgerows. Between July 7 and 19, American forces fought the brutal Battle of St. Lo, attempting to capture the crucial road junction that would serve as the jumping-off point for any major offensive. The fighting devolved into a savage, yard-by-yard struggle. Companies that started with 200 men emerged with 50. Battalions lost their command structures. The wounded overwhelmed field hospitals. And still, Rommel's hedgerows held. Tank crews developed a grim fatalism. They knew that attacking a hedgerow meant either getting stuck on top, exposing themselves to Panzerfaust fire, or ramming through after multiple attempts, only to face another identical hedgerow 50 yards beyond. Some crews estimated they would need to penetrate 60 to 70 hedgerows just to advance a single mile. At that rate, reaching Paris would take years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The psychological toll was devastating. American tankers, who had trained in the open deserts of California and Texas, found themselves fighting a claustrophobic infantry war inside steel coffins. Every advance brought them into point-blank range with an enemy they couldn't see until it was too late. The Bocage neutralized every advantage American armor possessed: speed, numbers, and maneuverability. Fear gripped even veteran units. Some tank commanders reported that their drivers refused orders to charge hedgerows, knowing it meant almost certain death. The U.S. Army tried everything. Tank-mounted bulldozer blades showed promise, but by late July only about 40 M4 Sherman tanks equipped with M1 bulldozer blades had reached Normandy. Even these required satchel charges to blast through the thickest hedgerows, and the work was agonizingly slow. Bradley's staff had requested 278 bulldozer blades, but production couldn't keep pace with the urgent tactical need. Time was running out. In the German command bunkers, Rommel's staff watched with satisfaction as their defensive strategy worked exactly as planned. Every day the Allies remained trapped in the Bocage was another day to bring up reinforcements, another day to strengthen defensive positions further south. The panzer divisions that had counterattacked the British at Caen were now rotating to face the American threat. If Rommel could hold until autumn, when weather would ground Allied air superiority, perhaps he could stabilize the front. Perhaps against all odds, he might even push back. By July 14, 1944, the situation approached crisis. Bradley knew he had to launch a massive offensive, Operation Cobra, to break through the German lines near St. Lo by July 25. But he also knew that without a solution to the hedgerow problem, Cobra would become just another costly failure. The weight of command settled heavily on his shoulders. Thousands of lives depended on finding an answer to Rommel's hedgerows, and no one in the entire Allied high command had won. The morning of July 14 brought no relief to the men of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Sergeant Curtis Culin sat on the front slope of his M5A1 Stuart light tank somewhere in the killing fields south of the Vire River. Around him, the Norman countryside stretched out in its deceptive tranquility. Gentle slopes, ancient orchards, and those damned hedgerows marking every boundary like the bars of an enormous prison. His tank, like hundreds of others, sat immobilized not by German guns, but by geometry and tactics that favored the defender absolutely. Culin had watched good men die in the Bocage. He had seen tanks brewing up, their crews screaming inside as ammunition cooked off from Panzerfaust hits to the belly armor. He had participated in attacks where his squadron lost half its vehicles in a single afternoon, gaining perhaps 300 yards of blood-soaked French farmland. The frustration was unbearable. They had the tanks, the ammunition, the fuel, the air support, everything except a way to use it. During a break in operations, Culin and other tankers gathered informally to discuss the problem. The conversation turned to various ideas that had been tried and failed. Someone mentioned the bulldozer blades, but everyone knew there were far too few. Engineers spoke bitterly of how many of their comrades had died placing demolition charges. Infantry officers described watching their men cut down in the confined killing zones between hedgerows. The mood was dark, bordering on despair. Then, according to military historian Max Hastings, a soldier from Tennessee, identified only as Roberts, made a comment that seemed almost childishly simple. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" Most of the men laughed. It sounded absurd. But Curtis Culin didn't laugh. His mind, which had been wrestling with the problem for weeks, suddenly seized on the concept. Saw teeth, not ramming through, not climbing over, cutting through. The idea was so obvious that its simplicity was brilliant. A tank with steel teeth protruding from its front could penetrate the base of the hedgerow, the earthen embankment, and literally plow through instead of riding up and over. Culin immediately began sketching designs. He needed heavy steel, formed into prongs or tusks that could bite into the earth and vegetation. The steel had to be strong enough to withstand the force of a 15-ton light tank or a 30-ton Sherman pushing at full power. It had to be positioned low on the glacis plate to attack the hedgerow's foundation. And it had to be something they could fabricate quickly in the field without waiting for factories back in England or America. But where would he find suitable steel? The hedgerows themselves had consumed most available scrap metal in modifications and repairs. Then Culin remembered the beaches. Back on the Norman coastline, still littered with the debris of D-Day, lay thousands of German beach obstacles. The same obstacles Rommel had ordered and placed by the millions during his frantic fortification of the Atlantic Wall. The Czech hedgehogs were perfect. These obstacles consisted of heavy steel angle iron beams welded into six-pointed jacks designed to rip the hulls out of landing craft. Rommel himself had ordered their construction and placement. The irony was perfect. Rommel's beach defenses would be dismantled and welded onto American tanks to defeat Rommel's hedgerow defenses. The enemy's steel would be turned against him. Working through the night, Culin supervised a small team that recovered several Czech hedgehogs from the nearest beach sector. They dismantled the steel beams with cutting torches and transported them back to their unit's maintenance area. Using portable arc welding equipment, Culin personally designed a prototype consisting of 4 heavy steel prongs welded to a frame that could be attached to the front of his tank. The prongs angled forward and downward, positioned to strike the base of a hedgerow like the tusks of a rhinoceros. The crucial test came on the morning of July 14 or 15. Accounts vary slightly on the exact date. Culin's modified tank approached a typical Norman hedgerow, one that had previously required 3 or 4 ramming attempts to breach. The tank's driver gunned the engine. The prongs bit into the earthen embankment. Instead of riding up and exposing the belly armor, the tank's front end stayed low, the steel tusks cutting into roots and soil. With a tremendous tearing sound, the tank plowed straight through, emerging on the other side with its guns still level and its armor protected. It worked. Against all odds, a simple field modification using enemy materials had solved the problem that had stumped engineers, generals, and tacticians for 6 weeks. Word spread through the 102nd Cavalry like wildfire. Other tank crews crowded around to see Culin's invention. Officers immediately recognized IT's significance. Within hours, the news reached higher headquarters. On July 14, 1944, General Omar Bradley and members of his 1st Army staff arrived at the 102nd Cavalry's position to inspect Sergeant Culin's hedgerow cutter personally. Bradley, under enormous pressure to launch Operation Cobra within days, watched as Culin's tank demonstrated the device on multiple hedgerows. The results were undeniable. Tank after tank, fitted with the steel prongs, punched through barriers that had previously required demolitions or bulldozers. Bradley immediately grasped the strategic implications. This wasn't just a clever field modification, it was a war winner. He turned to his ordnance officer and gave an order that would echo through the rest of the Normandy campaign: mass-produce the device immediately. Bradley ordered that ordnance units on the continent begin fabricating the cutters using every available piece of scrap metal from German beach obstacles. The device was designated the Rhinoceros or Rhino by those who first saw it, though it would also be called the Culin cutter, Culin hedgerow device, and various other names. Bradley also ordered Colonel John B. Medaris, the 1st Army's ordnance officer, to fly immediately to England with blueprints and instructions. Depots in the United Kingdom were to begin equipping tanks with the tusks before they even shipped to France. Additional arc welding equipment and specialized welding crews were to be flown to Normandy by air. By 6 o'clock that evening, units in France discovered they needed more welding equipment. By 8 o'clock, a plane was en route to England. Trucks waited at the airstrip when it returned before breakfast the next morning. In the sector near Saint-Jean-de-Day, a specialized workshop was established under the supervision of Warrant Officer Douglas, a professional welder in civilian life. Douglas had no formal plans for Culin's device, only the basic concept. He devised his own modified version, distinguished by triangular plates at each end of the prongs, which he believed would penetrate hedgerows more effectively. The 3rd Armored Division received 57 of these Douglas cutters before Operation Cobra. Other units and divisions fabricated their own variations. The 79th Division had independently developed a hedgecutter as early as July 5, though it was less effective than Culin's design. The XIX Corps demonstrated a salad fork arrangement with heavy frontal prongs. The V Corps invented a brush cutter and a green dozer. But Culin's design, using Rommel's own beach obstacle steel, proved the most effective and easiest to manufacture in quantity. The production effort became one of the most remarkable examples of battlefield innovation in military history. Welders worked around the clock. Combat engineers scoured the beaches for every Czech hedgehog and steel rail obstacle they could find. Maintenance companies that normally repaired battle damage instead fabricated tank tusks. The entire logistical system pivoted to equip as many tanks as possible before Operation Cobra's launch date. Bradley classified the Rhino devices as top secret. He ordered that none were to be used in combat until Operation Cobra began, preventing the Germans from developing countermeasures or understanding what was coming. For 10 days, equipped tanks sat in assembly areas, their crews forbidden to test their new weapons against the enemy. The wait was agonizing, but Bradley wanted maximum surprise. By July 25, 1944, when Operation Cobra finally launched, approximately 3 out of every 5 American tanks had been fitted with some version of hedgerow cutter. The transformation was staggering. Where previously a single hedgerow could delay an entire company for hours, now Sherman tanks and lighter vehicles plowed through barrier after barrier, maintaining momentum and keeping German defenders off balance. The morning of July 25 brought the largest carpet bombing of World War II. 500 B-17 and B-25 bombers dropping more than 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions north of St. Lo. Despite tragic friendly fire incidents that killed 111 Americans and wounded 490, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the bombardment shattered German defensive cohesion. Then came the Rhino tanks. The VII Corps, led by Major General J. Lawton Collins, spearheaded the breakthrough. Sherman tanks equipped with Culin cutters led the assault, cutting through hedgerows that would have stopped them cold just weeks before. The 9th, 4th, and 30th Infantry Divisions surged through gaps created by the Rhinos, exploiting the devastation left by aerial bombardment. For the first time since D-Day, American armor operated at speed, using maneuverability and mass to overwhelm German positions. The psychological impact on German defenders was devastating. They had spent 6 weeks learning that the Bocage neutralized Allied armor superiority. Now, sud. And American tanks were bursting through hedgerows at multiple points simultaneously, appearing where they shouldn't be able to go, maintaining offensive tempo that the Germans couldn't match. Rommel's carefully prepared defense in depth began to collapse. The German Panzer Lehr Division, already exhausted from fighting the British, was finally annihilated, according to its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein. About 1,000 men were killed or wounded in the initial bombardment alone. As American armor pushed deeper, the division's remaining tanks and vehicles were hunted down and destroyed. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division alone destroyed 64 German tanks and 538 other combat vehicles during Operation Cobra, suffering only 49 tank losses in return. The 2nd Armored inflicted over 7,370 German casualties, while suffering 914 of their own. The breakout from Normandy succeeded beyond even Bradley's expectations. By August 1, American forces had broken free of the Bocage and were racing across open country toward Brittany and Paris. The strategic stalemate that had threatened to make Normandy another World War I-style attritional nightmare ended in a matter of weeks. Rommel's defensive masterpiece, his carefully orchestrated use of terrain and prepared positions, had been defeated by a device that cost almost nothing to manufacture and required only hours to install. For his invention, Sergeant Curtis Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the United States' highest decorations for exceptional service. Both General Omar Bradley, in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, and Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower credited Culin's hedgerow cutter with saving countless lives and contributing decisively to Allied success in Normandy. The citation recognized that his innovation had solved a tactical problem that threatened the entire invasion's timetable. The British developed their own version of hedgerow cutters, which they called prongs, with the first 24 crafted from salvaged German beach defenses before large-scale production shifted to the United Kingdom. This demonstrated that Culin's basic concept was universally applicable and valued across the Allied coalition. Curtis Culin continued to serve with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron through the rest of 1944. 4 months after his invention changed the war in Normandy, he was severely wounded in the Huachen Forest, losing a leg to German fire. He returned home to Cranford, New Jersey, where he lived until his death on November 20, 1963, at the age of 48. In his obituary, the New York Times noted that he had invented a 4-pronged plow attachment for tanks that enabled them to drive directly through the great French hedges in a single night of work. The operational impact of the Rhino tank extended far beyond Operation Cobra. As Allied forces pushed across France, Belgium, and into Germany, the lessons learned from the Bocage fighting and the solutions developed by soldiers like Culin shaped tactical doctrine for the rest of the war. The principle that soldiers closest to the problem often conceive the best solutions became embedded in American military culture. The irony remains perfect and profound. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of history's most innovative tacticians, was defeated by his own materiel turned against him. The Czech hedgehogs he ordered and placed by the millions along the Atlantic Wall, intended to stop the invasion at the waterline, instead became the instruments of his hedgerow defense's destruction. The steel that was supposed to protect the Reich instead carved the path to its defeat. Rommel himself, wounded by Allied aircraft on July 17, never witnessed the full collapse of his Normandy defenses and was forced to commit suicide by the Nazi regime in October 1944 after being implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler. From the beaches of Normandy to the hedgerows of the Bocage, one sergeant with a welding torch and a salvaged enemy obstacle changed the course of World War II. Curtis Culin's story exemplifies the resourcefulness, ingenuity, and determination that characterized the soldiers who fought in history's greatest conflict. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Frontlines as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.